The WorldShift 2012 poses a challenge, and the way to meet the challenge is that new scientific spiritual way where science and spirit meets, which I call the Akashic experience. So one is the current situation, the other is the way, the new wavelengths, the new way in which we can change ourselves, as Gandhi said, so we can change the world. We are convinced of two things. One, that what we call a world shift, and I'll talk about it in a moment, has become necessary. And the second, that we can't meet this challenge alone. We can only meet it by cooperation, by pulling together. And this all until you have a critical mass of awakened people who will spread the word and who will begin the process of this fundamental change. This is really a planetary, global level shift that needs to start with civil society, needs to start with people. I think business will follow. I think politics will follow. Let me remind you of Einstein's saying that he first applied to his own theories and then to the situation of the world after Second World War, after the atomic bomb has been exploded. He said you can't solve a problem with the same kind of thinking in the context of which a problem arose. So we need new thinking. And I would say thinking here means new values, new beliefs, perhaps a new spirituality, a new way of looking at yourself and at the world. And then we could have a shift. Now, why do we need this shift? It's new and old at the same time. It's new, well, let me say first why it's old. It's old because human communities of a certain kind have always had a tendency to overexploit their environment. Up till about 8,000 years ago, this was not the case. Up to about 8,000 years ago, all human communities lived in the embrace of nature. Today we would say they were sustainable. They didn't know they were sustainable. They simply just didn't destroy the environment in which they operated, and they could keep going. Stone Age communities were sustained themselves for hundreds of thousands of years with very minor changes. What happened then, there's a certain type of mentality arose. I'm not saying it's bad. I think we have inherited this mentality, but I'm saying it's time to move beyond it. And this mentality arose in the Middle East, in the Levant, in the area that was known at the time as the Fertile Crescent. This Fertile Crescent was a verdant area. Of course, it was warm. It's North Africa, but it was forested. It had good possibilities for agriculture. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, etc. They lived in a friendly environment. They have then, in the course of the centuries and actually millennia, this has been deforested and became an arid land. Now, this was a local catastrophe, you might say. The brunt of the population that started from there moved into Europe, moved into Asia. Some of it moved also further down to Africa. The point is this, you see. That time, population was not very large. There were altogether, humanity was perhaps 1.5 million people. And the technologies were relatively modest. What we could do to nature didn't have that catastrophic consequences. Sure enough, locally we overused the environment. But we could move on. People could move on. They could exploit, colonize new territories, and the process could start. And through the Middle Ages, even this trend in the West learned to live relatively sustainably. This Western trend that landed in Europe through the Middle Ages received a decisive impetus when Galileo published his letters, Newton published his Principia Mathematica and Principia Physica, and then these great works were supported by the philosophy of Descartes, by the cosmology, by the astronomy of Copernicus and Kepler. What did all this mean? It meant that the world that is around us is a kind of a mechanism. We are not related to it. We can dominate this mechanism. We are over it. We have a conscious mind, and matter in the world doesn't have consciousness. Matter simply can follow what we do. So this kind of worldview created a whole movement, a tendency, which had a tremendous success in technology. When you discover the power of the steam, and the power of mass production, and the power of mechanized agriculture, transportation, all of that. Of course, there were good effects as well. Life expectancy expanded. We learned to correct for some diseases. At the same time, we created a more and more unhealthy environment, so we needed more and more corrections, to be able to survive. Now, we have learned that this globe is a spaceship, that it's a closed system. It's like a spaceship because everything that we do on it remains on it. You see, and this kind of what is new here, therefore, is not that we are overexploiting. What is new is that we are overexploiting and destroying on a global planetary scale. That's what's new. You see, we didn't notice that this is what's happening. Until then, the catastrophes, the problems were local. One could move on. One could also correct. The technologies were not as powerful as now. The population was not so large. Now, probably we are up to 7 billion people today. And the problems that we have are enormous. On the level of the ecology, on the level of the economy, we have probably half of the human population living in poverty. 2.3 billion are short of water, safe water. 1.5 billion living on the equivalent of $1 a day. And what's happening to big cities, what's happening to the countryside, is a process which is a consequence of our mentality, which we have exported, which simply says it's up to us to dominate, to do with this world what we want. It'll obey because it's a soulless and mechanical aggregate around us. There is a series of coincidences. I outlined several of them, almost a dozen of them in this book. A series of coincidences between ancient prophecies based on some kind of perennial intuition, which possibly was not invented. It's something that happens to the human mind, that's something that informs the cultures. When something persists for thousands of years, there is something to it. You can't simply just dismiss it. And this intuition that humanity, the human family, undergoes cyclic development. It's not just simply that we go little by little. You see, our notion of progress in the West has been, past few hundred years, linear. Always a little more. You do a little more, you invest a little more, you construct a little more, you build higher buildings, more highways, etc., etc. We live better and better, you see. This has not been the intuition. The intuition has been cycles. And mostly not just returning to the origin, but the helixes. You return on a higher level. You go around, you return, and you have a new cycle which starts on a higher level. Now, it's interesting that quite a few of these cyclic views that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, identify the end of 2012 as the end of a cycle and the beginning of another.